All right, homeostasis and feedback loops, Unit 4, I think this is our second set of notes. So cells communicate. They can attach to one another in three ways. The first way is called a tight junction, where strands of proteins, they can prevent leaks between adjacent cells. So the example is epithelium, and that's found in like stomach lining or skin and really kind of lines any organ. So they are really tight together, these proteins, and they prevent any kind of leaks from happening. The second way is called adherence junctions, where the proteins are attached to cell membranes that cement cells together, and they're anchored to the structure within the cell, the cytoskeleton. And these can be stretched, for example, a muscle. And the third way is called gap junctions. They help the cell communicate. They contain a small open channel that directly link the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. So they have this opening, and this is ideal for rapid feedback. So, and for example, in your heart, you might have a gap junction. So here's some of the gap junction. Here's the gap junction where we have this opening right in here. This opening. And then we have adherence junctions. For example, this is like your muscle, where these actin filaments, and they connect to the cytoskeleton, and they can stretch. And then we have tight junction, which is these kind of like in your skin epithelial cells, where these proteins just kind of make it so there's no leaks. So the levels of organizations, we've already talked about atom, which is this the smallest piece of matter that we can have. Two or more atoms can make up a molecule, and we know we have larger molecules called macromolecules, like those are our starches and things like that. Then we have molecules work together to make up cells, and then different cells can make up tissue. Tissue will then work together to make up organs. So like smooth muscle tissue is what makes up some of our muscle, which could then be found in our stomach or whatever. Then different organs will work together to make an organ system, like your digestive system, which is kind of shown here. And then different organ systems, so like digestive, cardiovascular, and integumentary system, they all work together to make the organism. The human body is adapted to, it always wants to be in balance. So it wants to maintain these internal conditions within a tolerable range. So we have kind of a range that we want to maintain, and when it exceeds that, then our body will respond to that. It also is adapted to locate and acquire nutrients and dispose of waste. It's adapted to protect itself against injury or microbial attack. So it'll send responses if we're injured. If we cut ourselves, our body sends responses. If we have a bacterial infection, our body sends responses. And it's also adapted to reproduce and provide for offspring during development. So what is homeostasis? This is a really important definition that you absolutely need to know. The maintenance of a stable internal environment in response to any kinds of changes. Well, we want to keep that stable internal environment within a range, and if it's not in that range, our body will respond to that. So, for example, if our external environment, if we go outside, changes, our body so the changing conditions of an external environment will then trigger a response for us to maintain the stable environment. If it's really cold out, my body might shiver. Changing conditions of an internal environment will also trigger responses. So if I have a fever, my body will respond to that so that I can get back to this stable internal environment. To maintain cells, tissues, and organs, they have various mechanisms that work to regulate the entire organism. So there's kind of some checks and balances, so to speak. Functional. The metabolism of an animal or plant is able to adjust to changes in conditions as they are detected. So this is really helpful. So if there's some changes that happen, our metabolism we can adjust, and then we can kind of make it back to our normal homeostasis, internal stable environment. So feedback mechanisms are the general mechanism of nervous or hormonal regulation in animals. So there's two types. We have negative and we have positive. So negative is when the response returns the conditions towards normal. This is really important. The word negate means return towards normal. Usually, this is what we see. This is more common, and in fact, you should connect this with, typically this is always good in our body, because it returns the condition towards normal. Positive feedback is when the response sends conditions further from normal. It increases the difference. So we're going away from homeostasis. We're getting away from our normal conditions. This tends to be, this tends to be not good in the body. It tends, not always. Sometimes it's good to have that positive feedback and get away from our homeostasis, but usually our body wants to stay at normal. So when we go further from normal, that's not usually a good thing. Not always, but it tends to not be good in our body as an organism. So feedback mechanisms have certain essential components. They have three things: 1, the receptor; 2, the control center; and 3, the effector. The receptor are the cells or tissues which detect the change due to the stimulus. The control center measures the change from ideal or resting conditions, and it kind of just takes this data and says, well, how far is it from our normal conditions? And then the effector is a response of a message via nerves or hormones or both. So it's like the receptor is, hey, there's something that's happening here. It's not normal. It sends it to the control center. The control center monitors it and says, yeah, we need to do something about this. It sends it to the effector, which can do something about it, and it sends out hormones to adjust it back to that normal condition. So here we have the stimulus. It's a change occurs in either the internal, could be external environment. And so these receptors are cells and tissues. Notice it. And they send that information to the control center, which is the set point. It compares it to the normal. And then it kind of decides whether we need to do something about it. So yes, we do. It sends something to the effectors, which are muscles or glands, and they will then send out a response like a hormone to adjust. And then it should go back to that, hopefully it then goes back to those cells and they say, yes, that's stopped. We can stop this whole process, this loop, or no, we need to keep doing this because it's not fixed yet. The receptor, the sensor, the cells or tissues that detect changes in internal or external environment. The control center receives the information from the sensors and initiates the response. The effector receives information from the control center and acts to bring about the changes needed. They may be a positive or negative stimulus that sends. So here's a negative feedback loop. You have your stimulus. We notice the homeostatic condition is not how it should be. The receptors, our cells and tissue, pick up on that. The control center, it then gets sent to the control center, which then sends it to the effectors to issue a response. And in this case, the response eliminates the change and returns the homeostatic condition back to normal. It negates it back to normal. Then we have a positive feedback. Here we have our stimulus. Our homeostatic condition changes. The receptors pick up on it and send that information to the control center. The control center measures it and decides that, yes, we need to do something about it. It sends to the effectors, which then send out a response like a hormone. And then what happens here, the response gets strengthened. So it gets farther from normal. That is a positive. It doesn't go back to normal, it gets farther from normal. Negative feedback is the most common because it brings it back to normal. Here's our negative feedback. Here's the desired temperature right here. Now what happens when the desired temperature, the temperature goes down? So the thermostat, the house cools. The temperature went down. The thermostat circuit closes, which in response turns on the furnace. The furnace turns on and it heats the house, and then what happens is it moves this temperature back to the desired temperature. If it's not quite there, it continues. The furnace stays on until it gets back to the desired temperature. Once it gets to the desired temperature, then let's say it starts to heat up and it goes past the desired temperature. Now the house warms. The thermostat circuit opens up and it causes it to turn off the furnace, which then cools the house. It brings it back towards the desired temperature. So the biggest thing here is it brings this whole negative feedback, brings back to normal. Examples, we have blood glucose. So you eat a sugary meal, that's the receptor. The hypothalamus in our brain receives the information, that's the control center. The hormone insulin is released and it speeds up the transport of glucose out of the blood and into selected tissue, that's the effector. So now the blood has less sugar in it, and so we brought it back to normal. Exercise, it creates metabolic heat, which raises the body temperature. Here's the receptor. The hypothalamus in the brain monitors the body temperature, that's the control center, and then it realizes that our temperature is too high. So we have cooling mechanisms such as vasodilation, so that causes our skin to be flushed red, and also sweating, and that's the effector. And so our body cools back down and then it might stop that. Positive feedback is less common, which is understandable as most changes to steady state pose a threat. So these can be more harmful to us because what happens is we get farther from normal. So normally that's not good. So that's the threat. We don't want to get farther from normal, but sometimes they can be helpful. So one of the ways is like if you just had a baby. The baby, they always say to try to nurse the baby right away. The baby begins to suckle at the mother, and then a few drops of milk are released. That's the effector. Then we have the posterior pituitary gland in the brain. It receives the information, that's the control center, and it encourages the baby and it releases a hormone called prolactin in the mother, which further stimulates the response and allows you to release the milk. So this is a positive feedback loop because humans are not normally releasing milk. But so this causes it to do that, and it increases the release of milk. So that's going farther from the normal. In this case, that's a good thing. Here's another example of a positive feedback loop. Ripening of an apple released the volatile plant hormone ethylene. That's the effector. The nucleus of cells receive that information, the control center. Ethylene accelerates the ripening of unripe fruit in the vicinity. So nearby fruit also ripens, and that releasing more ethylene is the response. All right, so here we are done. We'll talk and do more practice with positive and negative feedback loops later in class.